I never expected for something like this to happen at a customer's house. Part 1. Knock knock. No answer. Hello? I called after waiting on the front porch for over a minute. Low-cost plumbing. Still nothing. I usually wasn't this persistent, but it was almost 7 o'clock and this was my last stop of the day. Plus, the house's garage door was wide open, and there was a car in the driveway. Somebody was obviously home. Hello? Is anybody there? I tried one last time to get the attention of the homeowner, but the house still sounded silent. I began to step off the porch and back away from the doorway when the door swung open. It was so silent beforehand and the opening was so sudden that I nearly jumped when it happened. Once I gathered myself, I looked at the incredibly unpunctual man in the doorway. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting, sir." The man apologized. "I was just changing my clothes really quickly." At 7 in the evening? I thought. "That's all right." I held back my sassy comment. "Now, you said you had a problem with your toilet?" "Yes, of course." He stepped out of the doorway and made room for me to enter. "Please come in." I stepped into the house's main foyer and the man shut the door behind me. "The bathroom's right this way." He started walking down a hallway and motioned for me to follow. "So, the toilet's been making these really strange noises, and it gets clogged really easily, which makes the water take really long to fill back up again. When did this start happening?" I asked. He stopped at a doorway and put his hand on the doorknob. "Like, 4 days ago." He pushed the door open and revealed a small, undecorated bathroom. The walls were a highly pristine white with barely any blemishes. It seemed as though it could have been used as a solitary confinement room. The toilet was on the back wall, and it appeared to be mostly normal. I walked in and kneeled down in front of the bowl. "Have you found anything inside the toilet that might be blocking the water flow?" The man shook his head. "No. I couldn't see anything. Not even when I used my plunger." "Does anyone else live with you in this house? Someone else who could have possibly clogged this toilet?" The man thought for a moment. I thought this was strange because he should know if someone else is or isn't living there. I thought that maybe he knew the answer but didn't want to say anything for whatever reason. I faced out towards the man and waited for an answer. The man responded after only a few seconds, but it felt like an awkward eternity. "No. I live here alone. No one else that I know of could have done this." I turned back to the toilet and pushed down the small silver lever in an attempt to see exactly where the problem was occurring. I didn't exactly fully trust this guy, so I had to see for myself. The water circled around and around in a small whirlpool, but at the point where the bowl was supposed to drain down into the pipes, the whirlpool stopped. The water began to slowly rise and then it stopped a few inches below the rim of the bowl. A strange, low squeaky sound echoed from deep inside. I sat staring at the white porcelain toilet with a genuinely confused expression. I had seen several toilets get clogged before. More than half of the times I was called, the problem could have been fixed by simply plunging or flushing a few more times. This was different, however. I grabbed the plunger that sat directly against the back wall. I knew it probably wouldn't do any good. Nonetheless, I wanted to see what exactly would happen. Once I stuck the plunger into the bowl, I realized that the man was still standing in the doorway, unblinkingly watching me with his beady little blue eyes. I turned to him. "You know you don't have to stay and watch the whole time." The man blinked a few times and then shook his head around slightly. It was like he put himself into a trance by watching a plumber operate a toilet. "Sorry," he replied, dazed, "I'll let you do your work." Without another look, the man walked out of the doorway and out of my sight. I attempted to shrug this off and began to shove the plunger into the nearly overflowing toilet bowl. The water was mostly clear, but it was slightly murky. I guessed it was due to the toilet not being flushed for such a long time. I couldn't feel anything clogging the bowl yet. But I knew something had to be wrong. After several long minutes of forcefully pushing the plunger around, I took it out and set it in the bathtub to dry. I turned back to the bowl. I got an idea, but I debated against it for a moment. I knew what I had to do but hated doing it, especially at a customer's house. Eventually, I caved and took the long plastic gloves out of my jean pockets. I put the gloves on and looked down into the water again. I knew I would have to reach deep inside in order to find the source of the problem. I shut my eyes tight, foolishly thinking that would muffle the feeling on my hands, and I plunged my gloved right hand into the water. I reached as far as I could into the bowl and began feeling around for anything. I felt several things which almost made me gag and knew those weren't the central cause of the clogging, so I kept searching. At this point, my glove was almost completely submerged in the water and the murky goop was nearly touching my arm. I reached further and felt something with an odd shape and texture. I yanked it, but it barely budged. I pulled again. Still the object remained stationary. I put my left hand against the bowl and planted my feet firmly on the floor. I pulled at it for a third time. This time, it finally broke free slightly. I didn't stop. I kept on vigorously yanking at the strange object until it was completely unplugged from the pipes. Once it was free, I precariously pulled the object out of the pipes while attempting to avoid all the other disgusting objects floating in the water. When my hand was finally touched by the light, I could see what was plugging the drain all this time. It was nearly impossible to tell exactly what the object was. It looked like a small burnt piece of seaweed crossed with a mummified plate of spaghetti and meatballs. The whole thing was small and had been compacted into a strange ball shape with a few lumps coming out of one side. Even though I was wearing gloves, I didn't want to handle it any longer than I needed to. I could feel the texture through my glove. It was mushy and moist. I searched around the bathroom for anything I could put the object in. I spotted a small garbage can with a plastic bag that hadn't been used yet. I snatched the bag and tossed the object inside. I closed up the bag and walked to the bathroom doorway, calling for the man. "Sir, I found what was jamming your toilet," I proclaimed, holding the bag as far away from my body as possible. There was no answer. I didn't hear anything. The house was still. I didn't even hear any movement on the floor upstairs. "Sir?" Still silence. There suddenly came a loud clang. It scared me to death because of the hugely abrupt change in volume. It had gone from no sound to a sharp, piercing metallic bang. It sounded as though someone had just fallen very hard onto an iron sheet. I left the bathroom and began to search for the man to see if he was all right. In every room I looked through, everything seemed to be at a standstill, as if no one had ever gone in. As if it was just a display room for some sort of museum. I kept scanning the house until I saw a hallway where one of the doors was noticeably ajar. I slowly walked towards the door, pulled it the rest of the way open. There was a staircase that led very far down underground. I could tell there was a dimly lit room at the bottom. I couldn't see much, but I saw that there was a stone floor and a red light was illuminating the room. I didn't want to descend the stairs even though I knew I had to. I gulped and then stepped onto the first stair. I was too nervous to call out for the man or say anything for that matter. As I went further and further down the steps, the room came more and more into view. When I got to the bottom step, the room fully opened up and I saw everything. Every last horrible thing. The floor was completely covered in a brown stone of some kind. It was plain. Maddeningly plain. The walls may have been black, or they may have been some other shade of dark gray. I truly couldn't tell because every inch too of the wall was covered with various newspaper and magazine articles. I looked closer and examined a few of them specifically. I read things such as, 10 adult male skulls found in ditch. Manson denies 8th murder. Madman kills and eats 13 victims. This monster murdered 5 women. Ted Bundy escapes in Colorado. Woman found dead in her home with horrible craters on both sides of her head. 20 lost children were found dead. The 15 most infamous killers of the last 100 years. Gein claims he was in a daze during the murders. These articles covered the walls in the same way young girls decorate their walls with posters and drawings. Many articles were overlapping or were piled directly on top of each other. Some spilled out onto the floor and ceiling as well because there wasn't enough room on the wall. They were all different, too. Many talked about similar, but they all told different stories from different viewpoints. And all of them talked about killings and murders. Several of the papers had blood splattered on them as if it were a canvas. All the papers, however, were lighted by the ominous red light on the ceiling in the center of the room. This gave the room a much more chilling and unsettling atmosphere. Directly below the light, there was a woman. She had been horribly beaten and several parts of her body were scarred or bleeding. A messy mob of dirty black hair almost completely covered her face. She was sitting on the floor in a large pool of blood sweat. She was completely naked. Both of her ankles were shackled, and the chains led to 2 different support beams on different sides of the room. From the way the woman was initially positioned, I could only see her left hand and arm as it was sitting lazily on her leg. Her left wrist also had a shackle that led to another large support beam. Whoever put this poor woman down here was obviously torturing her with no intent of ever letting her go free. Then, the woman's head jerked slightly, which made most of the hair fall away from her face and more towards the side of her head where it belonged. She locked eyes with me. Her face wore an expression of petrified terror. However, once she realized who was looking back at her, her face became less horrified and more anxiously excited. She got to her feet and attempted to walk towards me, but the chains restricted her and pulled her back after she walked only a few feet forward. The woman realized her foolish mistake and looked back at the chains that were mercilessly confining her. I noticed that the woman had several small pools of blood falling down her legs. I felt absolutely disgusted, primarily because I didn't know if the blood was from the puddle on the floor or if it was flowing directly from her legs. The woman turned back to me and attempted to outstretch her left hand towards me, but she found, yet again, that she was unable to do so because of the confining chains. She resorted to lifting her right arm and reaching it out towards me for assistance. Except I immediately noticed something wrong. Not only was the woman's right arm almost entirely red from fresh and dried blood, there was also something missing. I blinked a few times thinking that the red light was making me seeing things that weren't there, but unfortunately I saw exactly what I thought. I looked at the woman's shoulder and followed her upper arm all the way down to her elbow. From there, I continued scanning down her forearm until I reached her wrist. That's what was strange. There was only the wrist. Nothing was after. The arm ended abruptly as soon as the wrist started. There was no right hand at all. The woman reached out to me with only a small red stub. I instantly realized something. 2 and 2 suddenly came together. I glanced down at the small plastic bag in my hand. Even though I still had the gloves on, I didn't even want to think about touching the object inside. Especially since I now knew what it was. I looked away from the bag. I refused to let the thought of that object enter my mind. But, my hands didn't listen to my brain because my right hand reached into the bag and pulled out the object I had retrieved from the toilet upstairs. It still felt gooey and gross, but I needed to see it to certify what it was. I hesitated greatly before my gaze shifted back down to the object in my hand. When I did, I could almost immediately identify what it was. I looked back and forth between the object and the poor woman's wrist. I was holding the woman's severed right hand. Someone had cut off the woman's hand and shoved it right into the toilet. The woman stared at her detached appendage with fear. Her face turned slightly wide and I could almost hear her begin to cry. She looked back at me. "Please," she anxiously whispered so she wouldn't be heard by her captor, "help me." I glanced at the woman's shackles and chains. Then I quickly surveyed the room for anything to break her out, but there was nothing. Only paper, and it was everywhere. "How?" I asked nervously. The woman examined the support beams she was chained to. She looked back at me. "You could try and BR." The woman's eyes darted to the area right behind me. She froze. Her eyes widened and her face drained of color. Her mouth sat slightly open. I couldn't tell if it was from fear or because she just froze in the middle of the word, but I was too scared to figure that out. I turned around to see what had made her so afraid. I faced back towards the staircase, and I saw the man once again. He was standing in the doorway at the top of the stairs with a grin that spread all the way across his face. His dead eyes were fixated directly on mine. For several long moments, no words were spoken. There was a fearful silence throughout the room. I wanted to do something. I wanted to run right up the stairs and tackle the man to the ground, but I couldn't. My feet stayed exactly where they were, and my body was much too frozen by fear to do any sort of fighting. So, I just stood there and tried to understand exactly how I had gotten into this situation. Why did that man bring me here? Did he truly want his toilet to be unplugged? Then why did he leave the basement door open? I stopped. It all came together. He wanted me to find this woman down here. But why? Why me? Then the man lifted his right arm and pointed directly at me. "You're next," he muttered in a tone that sounded like he was about to start giggling. Before I could even think, the man backed away from the stairs and stood in the doorway. He withdrew a small black object from his black pocket. I couldn't tell what it was at first because of the odd lighting in the room and the distance between us. He pointed the object at me. Only then did I realize he was about to shoot me. I tried to run to the side and evade the man's shot, but it was too late. There was a bang followed by a pain in my right thigh. It didn't hurt. Not nearly as much as I thought it would, but it caused me to stop nonetheless. The poor woman behind me started to scream. I looked up at the man who shot me. He backed away from the doorway and slammed the door shut. I heard the sound of a lock being turned. I suddenly started to feel faint. I looked down at where the man had shot me. This was no bullet. This was a tranquilizer. The bastard shot me with a tranquilizer. I tried to pull it out, but I suddenly collapsed to my knees. I felt like I just couldn't stand anymore. The rest of my body hit the floor and I began to fade away from reality. Eventually, all was silent. I saw nothing but darkness.